When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, we reveal how the tenacity of a team of forensic scientists helped finally catch the killer of 2 children in Brighton.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can now go to my grave knowing that we have justice for my little girl.
And on moorland near Bradford, expert analysis of human remains reveals details of how one couple planned and carried out a brutal murder.
At first, the police thought the bones were animal bones until an expert witness was able to identify that these were in fact human remains.
There are so many important pieces of evidence that all play their part. We should consider them as a kind of a product rather than a sum, so one piece doesn't add to the next, it actually multiplies.
Brighton, 1986. 2 9-year-old girls, Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, have disappeared. Expert witness Roy Green was working at a forensics lab as a junior scientist. 25 years later, he would be the man who helped solve the case.
It was on the news and it's very, quite high profile. But actually, the victims lived in the same part of Brighton that I used to live when I was a student. I've had thousands of cases over my career as a forensic scientist. But every now and again, one will come along that really has quite a personal effect, a personal resonance with me.
The case became known as Babes in the Wood, after the woodland at Wild Park where the girls' bodies were discovered. For journalist Chris Summers, it was one of the most harrowing cases he has ever covered.
This is Wild Park, which is obviously quite a large area. It's, a really attractive place for a kid who lives at Molscombe, just on the other side of the road, but it is a very busy main road, and Karen and Nicola were specifically not allowed to come here to play. Their parents would prefer them to play, within sight of the house. The case was, a case of 2 little girls who went out to play after school or in the evening, and they just never came home.
Nicola's father, Barry, will never forget the moment he found out the girls were missing.
She was very, very prompt with Thursday nights. I said, they'll be home in a minute. You've got EastEnders, you've got Top of the Pops. They're not going to miss them, are they? And then, come to 8 o'clock, got a bit worried then. I said, we better phone the police, This is more serious than we think.
When the girls were reported missing, the police immediately organised a massive search and involved volunteers from the local community.
For 24 hours or so, the 2 little girls were missing. It was a huge manhunt. They were looking in houses and back gardens and eventually in Wild Park as well.
The following day, the girls were found.
Police in Brighton have discovered the bodies of 2 small girls who disappeared yesterday evening.
I remember it forever now. There's 3 policemen come in, and the little man in the middle said, "I'm afraid to say that Nicola's been found and she's dead." Why? Why then? Who?
Detectives were already suspicious of one man, Russell Bishop. He was a local who had helped with the search, but displayed some unusual behaviour.
Wild Park, it's an enormous area. They could be anywhere here. Russell Bishop happened to run in the direction of where the bodies were found. And obviously, that was more than curious to the police.
Various witness statements put Bishop near the scene of the crime. And there was further evidence. A blue sweatshirt found on a path between the park and Moulsecoomb railway station.
The sweatshirt was a blue, quite grubby, paint smears on it, and it was handed in. And then it became more important because it got identified as possibly coming from Russell Bishop.
Investigators found blue fibres matching the sweatshirt at the scene of the crime. Bishop was tried for murder, but pleaded not guilty. He claimed the sweatshirt was not his, and there was little forensic evidence to prove otherwise.
This was the mid-80s. DNA was in its infancy, so the evidence against him was, fairly circumstantial. It was inferences about, where he'd been and what he'd said to people. But very crucial to that, there was a lot of questions about that time of death.
The girls had been seen alive up until 6:30 p.m. An eyewitness also claimed to have seen Bishop leaving the park at that time.
The time of death is crucial. If the defence could prove that, he was seen somewhere else at the time that the girls are believed to have died, then, he couldn't be guilty.
And so the judge directed, if the jury felt that the girls were alive at a certain time, then they must acquit. So it really didn't matter what evidence was there forensically, they didn't get a chance to consider it.
The police's case collapsed after that. I said, "This ain't looking good, mate. I'm starting to believe that you're not going to find this man guilty. I don't think you're pushing it enough." And as the consequence is that he was found not guilty.
The case remained unsolved, but 3 years later, Bishop was under investigation again, this time for an attack on a young girl. She was left for dead, but survived. Evidence found by Roy Green helped secure a conviction.
We found DNA on an item he'd thrown away that matched Bishop and matched the victim. And so that helped to provide the evidence which convicted him.
There was a lot of similarities, but you can't convict people just on, a crime being similar. You had to have something more than that.
In 2003, changes to the law allowed some cases to be retried. So, police once again attempted to prosecute Bishop for the murder of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway. But their evidence was considered insufficient for a retrial. Then in 2011, advances in forensic science gave detectives new hope, and they reopened the case, but it wouldn't be easy.
With this case, Bishop had already been acquitted. If the case has been tried before at court, you're in what's called a double jeopardy, which means that you have to have new and compelling evidence. All your ducks have to be in a row before you can go, because you only get one shot.
Roy began with a new examination of the sweatshirt. He found DNA on the cuff and matched it to Bishop. But 25 years of investigation had created a problem.
An important part of the process is checking the reliability of it. And another of my colleagues was specifically tasked with doing this for every item. And it was her view that because of the processes that had carried on and the way in which the item had been handled and treated and passed about and examined with other things previously, that you couldn't necessarily say that the piece of DNA that we got there because it was part of the crime rather than being transferred by some other method.
But Roy was not about to give up. Instead, he began a search for new fibre evidence.
This is a comparator. And basically you've got two microscopes that are identical. And what that allows you to do is get two fibres that you think might match alongside each other, and then you can compare them, seeing them both at the same time, and then you can apply different lighting to them. So we would apply white light, blue light and UV light and compare them and see if they match under all circumstances.
Roy hoped to use fibre analysis to prove that Russell Bishop did indeed own the controversial blue sweatshirt by linking it to other items in his possession.
We found that there were blue acrylics which could have come from the sweatshirt on his trousers, and there were patchy peach acrylic fibres found on the sweatshirt which were present on a pair of socks at his house. There were links to items that we know Bishop had worn, but also to this item that he says he hasn't worn or doesn't know anything about. It's not his, and yet there were fibres there that linked him to it.
Roy had found the first ever evidence to show Russell Bishop did own the sweatshirt. He now looked for more fibre evidence to link the garment to the bodies of the two girls.
So we've got pink polyesters from Nicola's jumper found on the sweatshirt, and we've got blue acrylics from the sweatshirt found on the jumper.
In forensics, the more fibre links you can find, the better. It's painstaking work, and it can't be rushed.
When you look at fibre evidence, you say, OK, so there's fibres on this item that match that item. How could that happen? Well, either the two items have been in contact, or this person's come into contact with another source of those fibres that just happen to be the same. The more links you have, and if you have cross links going both ways, the stronger the evidence becomes, because it multiplies the number of coincidences until they become, so many that they test credibility.
Roy continued to study the sweatshirt and began an analysis of paint stains on the sleeve.
Flakes of matching that paint were found on the tapings of Karen Hadaway's clothes. And so it became clear, really, that whoever had murdered the girls had worn the sweatshirt.
Roy was building a new and compelling forensic case against Russell Bishop. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered a new lead themselves. 25 years earlier, one key witness said they saw Bishop leave the park while the girls were still alive. But now, a new witness had come forward.
There was a crucial witness that they discovered in their new inquiry who remembered seeing Bishop going back into the park. It suggested that the timeline at the first trial may have been all wrong, and that could prove, and did prove, absolutely vital.
Detectives now had evidence Bishop was in the park at the time of the girls' death. They had fibre evidence linking the sweatshirt to the bodies and proof that the sweatshirt belonged to him. But, thanks to modern science, Roy had one more damning piece of evidence to offer.
During the post-mortem, the pathologist took tapings of exposed skin areas from the girls. We found some cellular material, and we cut that out and submitted it for DNA profiling. And when the results came back, they showed that Karen Hadaway's DNA was there, but it was also DNA from someone else.
Detectives ran the sample through the national database and found a match. Russell Bishop. In 2018, 32 years after Karen and Nicola had been murdered, he was back in the dock. It took Roy Green 3 days to deliver all his evidence.
There was never an eyewitness or a smoking gun. It was all forensic evidence, which together made it clear to the jury that Bishop was guilty.
There was paint, there was fibres, there was hairs. But not only that, but we had DNA evidence, and that was extremely strong.
Russell Bishop was at last found guilty of the double murder of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway. He was sentenced to life in prison.
This is a memorial that's been constructed quite recently, maybe 200 yards from the main road. It's really heartbreaking how close they were to their sanctuary of their homes. You can imagine for the parents how awful it was. It's been so many years before they actually got the right man. There was always that doubt until the final moment.
It is satisfying to be able to kind of know that you played a part in helping to solve a case. And that's always good because it provides closure for victims' families, and that's really why I'm in it.
Roy Green knew what he was talking about. The evidence was irrefutable. I can't thank the man enough. What a clever man. Him and all the people around him. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can now go to my grave knowing that we have justice for my little girl. And it's justice that is well deserved.
Skeletal remains, they can survive for thousands of years potentially, so the manner in which a body is disposed of, concealed, buried, will leave traces of evidence on the skeleton which can be used to interpret what's happened to the body after death.
March 1997. Oxenhope Moor, North Yorkshire. Bones are found in a lay-by. Criminal psychologist Ruth Tully followed the case with interest.
At first, the police thought the bones were animal bones until an expert witness was able to identify that these were in fact human remains. Tragic, tragic case. I often work with people with serious violence convictions and also appear in the court as an expert witness. And what's really interesting about this case is that the way events transpired, a murderer was left on the streets for up to a decade.
Detectives had the bones, but little else to go on. Roy Lambert is a major crimes detective and knows well the challenge of cases like this one.
Scenes where bones are found and nothing much else, they can be very, very difficult to try and identify. As an investigator, you need a starting point. If you can't identify who they are, where do you go looking?
Detectives had a silent witness. Now they needed to reveal its story. Was it someone who died on the moor from natural causes, or something more sinister? They turned to expert witness and forensic osteologist Martin Everson.
The principal role of forensic osteology is to provide a profile of the individual from the skeleton. The less material you have and the more damaged it is, the less you can say and the less precision with which you can say it. You just have to make do with what you have.
Martin began by assessing the extent of the bones that had been recovered.
So in this case, we'd evidently got a partial skeleton. It was incomplete. The skull and mandible, jaw, were missing. The upper limbs were missing. The lower limbs were missing below the mid-shaft of the femur, or thigh bones, of both the left and right side. So these were the remains of a torso.
As Martin studied the remains more closely, he uncovered a first clue.
The value of the pelvis in estimating or assigning the sex is enormous because of the key biological difference between men and women, which is that women give birth and hence they require a relatively open birth canal. And in this instance, the pelvis was clearly that of a robustly built adult male.
Martin was also able to reveal to detectives an indication of when this man died.
There was a little bit of dry, soft tissue left on some of the bones, but typically this partial skeleton was very clean, suggesting that it was some time since death, at least months probably.
But as his forensic analysis continued, Martin discovered shocking evidence of a dark end to the man's life.
There were signs that the femurs, the thigh bones, had been chopped through. There were also signs of burning on the bones. So that suggested to me that an attempt had been made to burn the torso. The remaining evidence on the skeleton was indicative of an attempt to dispose of the body by dismemberment and burning.
It was now clear to detectives that they were dealing with murder.
Cases like this highlight just how important evidence is for effective investigation. If the police didn't know what had happened to the body, they'd have much fewer clues to go on and perhaps not even have an accurate timeline of what had happened.
Martin concluded the body had been left on the moor months earlier. Police now knew when the crime had taken place, but still had no idea who the victim was. And in 1996, science could not yet identify DNA from the badly burnt bones. The case ran cold for nearly a decade.
It's one thing the police having a body, but identifying the body is a different matter. That breakthrough didn't come until 8 long years later in 2004, when DNA techniques had developed further. These breakthroughs in DNA and technologies are essential for effective investigation.
Scientists were now able to identify DNA from the tiniest of traces, and when they took samples from the bones this time, they detected a profile. A comparison with the police database confirmed the skeleton was that of 49-year-old Lenny Fulberg.
Lenny Fulberg was a Tyneside man, known locally as a wheeler-dealer, and he had many children. Some reports say up to 32, some say up to 50, but clearly he had a big family.
Lenny Fulberg had a substantial rap sheet with convictions for dishonesty, violence and indecency.
With regards to victims' background, really, as a police investigator, it doesn't matter. We should treat everybody as equal and do our utmost to find out who's responsible.
The identification gave the case a brand new line of inquiry. Fulberg had been released from prison in 1996, just months before the body was found. Police began to investigate Fulberg's previous relationships.
Investigations led to Lenny's former partner, Tracy Cameron, and her new partner, Graham Haylett. Lenny and Tracy had children, but when Lenny was remanded into custody in 1996, she started an affair with Graham.
Investigators found out from Fulberg's family that on his release from prison, he had made arrangements to meet Tracy in Bradford.
It's reported that Tracy asked Lenny to meet her on the pretense of discussing access to their shared children.
No one had any contact with Lenny after this meeting. Police grew increasingly suspicious.
If you're fortunate enough to identify the owner of these bones, it really opens up the investigation. In the case of Lenny Fulberg, it then gave the investigators the opportunity to look back at his movements, his history. They found he'd gone missing. They looked at his associations with his partner and the fact that partner had got another boyfriend now, and then the case started to unravel.
Detectives discovered letters between Tracy Cameron and her new partner Graham Haylett. These made clear their anger at Fulberg for his past crimes, Tracy's fear for the safety of her children, and a plot by the pair to murder Fulberg. Evidence from expert witness Martin Everson revealed how they disposed of the body.
So we found classic features of dismemberment. This type of analysis really is about trying to understand the circumstances or means of deposition and disposal. So we found 7 skeletal elements that showed evidence of cut marks, and these were very distinctive. So there were V-shaped cut marks, which which is typically caused by a sharp bladed instrument such as a knife, and also several indicators that a saw was used.
In 2006, Tracy Cameron and Graham Haylett were tried for murder. The letters they exchanged showed their actions were premeditated. Martin's forensic evidence revealed the lengths they took to cover up their crime and to hide the victim's identity for 8 years.
A good witness, they must be good in the witness box and talk in a language that the jury understands and be convincing. Because it's no point in spending thousands and thousands of pounds on an expert witness if they can't deliver the evidence in the witness box. It's really important that they present the evidence in an understandable way to the jury, but in the witness box, they've got to come across in layman's language and convince the jury that their evidence is strong and believable.
I think in this case, osteological analysis was a unique component. This was a deliberate attempt to dismember and dispose of the body. It would have required a degree of planning and shows that an attempt was made to conceal the crime. Not dimensions of a person's behaviour that can be associated with some kind of psychopathology.
Martin's evidence convinced the jury that the murder of Lenny Fulberg was a cold and calculated act. The pair were found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 20 years.
It's reported that Tracy and Graham killed Lenny after they found out that he'd been in prison for child sexual offences. So on one hand, this could have been a vigilante-style attack, but on the other hand, this could have been a misguided way that Tracy thought that she was protecting her own children from their father. If it wasn't for the work of the expert witness, we'd never have known how the bones were attempted to be disposed of. And on top of that, if it wasn't for the hard work of the police, we'd never have known who attempted to dispose of them.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we discover how the study of insects was crucial in solving the mystery disappearance of a Warrington teenager.
We didn't know how she got there. We couldn't find any sort of sightings of her, and nothing. She just disappeared completely.
And how an expert witness analysed expensive paintings and revealed the work of a skilled forger.
But it's really only in the last 20 to 30 years that it's taken off in terms of analysing artworks to work out when, where they were painted, perhaps by who.
If a body has been lying in an area for a long period of time, the chances are you are going to find insect evidence.
Warrington, 2003. 17-year-old Shafila Ahmed is a pupil at this sixth form college. She's an ambitious and diligent student who enjoys an active social life. So when she didn't appear at school, it was clear something was wrong.
The bright student who was studying A-levels and dreamed of being a lawyer was last seen by her parents on September the 11th.
Detective Geraint Jones from Cheshire Police was put in charge of the investigation.
The media attention was huge, really, from the first announcements, really, that we were looking for Shafila. You know, you got a 17-year-old girl who's missing.
17-year-old Shafila Ahmed.
Shafila Ahmed.
Shafila Ahmed.
We need the public to help us. We don't solve anything without witnesses. So a lot of this was an appeal for help, for someone who may know something, to come forward and tell us. And we didn't get anything, really. We didn't get anything.
With no information from the public, attention began to fall on one unusual aspect of the case.
Questions have been raised as to why the parents didn't report their daughter missing. It was teachers at her old school who got in touch with the police.
She finished work at a call centre in Warrington where that was the last independent sighting of her. There was some suspicion that something had happened to Shafila and the parents had never reported her missing.
Shafila's parents responded to pressure from the media and gave an interview.
I'm not a strict parent in any way whatsoever, right? Well, I just waited until Monday, right, if she hadn't turned up in school, because we assumed automatically that she's gone with her friends or a boyfriend, possibly. But that's one of the reasons that we thought, well, we'll give it a couple of days, see if she turns up in school, and then try and solve the matter.
Jasvinda Sengera works for Karma Nirvana, a charity that offers support for victims of domestic abuse. She felt increasingly uneasy when she saw Shafila's father speaking on the news.
It was in that role as a campaigner that I identified the case of Shafila Ahmed. I actually remember hearing about the case, driving into work one morning and hearing her father talk about how she has gone missing, but she's probably at her boyfriend's house. And I thought, alarm bells immediately, because in the history of supporting victims of honour abuse and forced marriages, I can tell you that fathers would not give permission for their daughter to date. So I thought, something's not right here.
We were trying to, look up under every stone for Shafila, but also at the same time starting to investigate. So a real shift in mindset. We've done a lot of liaison with the family. So every time a body was found, we'd be informing them, just to let you know, out of courtesy. Anyway, Iftika says, come back when you're 100%, otherwise I don't want to know. So again, they come away and say, that's bizarre behaviour. So it makes you start to think there's more to it.
For 5 months, there was still no sign of Shafila. Then Geraint got word of a shocking discovery.
I was driving into work on a Tuesday morning and I heard it on the news that a body had been found.
The badly decomposed body of a young woman was discovered in the Lake District.
The body was found in Cumbria, more than 70 miles away from Shafila's home in Warrington. But dental records and DNA confirmed it was her.
This is the banks of the River Kent where Shafila's body was found. Shafila's body was in the bushes just behind that rock that's now got a lot of moss on it there. She's not someone that would have just died naturally quickly at her age. And if it's not natural and then she's not found her way here on her own, then what other conclusion can you come to other than her death is as a result of a third party? Someone just doesn't come to somewhere like this and curl up and die. Someone puts them here.
They had found Shafila's body, but there were now more questions and still very few answers.
We've now got a body. We didn't know how she got there. We couldn't find any sort of sightings of her, nothing. She just disappeared completely from that 11th of September. So how did she get there and how long has she been there?
Grant had to find answers to these questions. With so little to go on, he turned to entomology, the study of insects. An expert witness, Amorette Whitaker.
When a body first dies, the body will start to decompose straight away, basically. And when the body starts to create an odour, that attracts insects, specifically blowflies, so blue bottles and green bottles. So they're attracted to the body to feed on it and for the females to lay her eggs on it. And after approximately 24 hours or so, the eggs will hatch out as first instar larvae, so these are very, very small larvae, and they will start feeding on the body straight away. The larvae will molt twice. This allows them to grow as they're feeding.
Amorette hoped that by studying the various life stages of the insects, she would be able to start putting together a timeline of events.
You want to find the oldest insects at the scene. Once they finish feeding on the body, they're going to leave the body to pupate. When the larvae leave the body, they're going to try and burrow into the soil and under vegetation in order to find somewhere to pupate. So what we need to do is just move some of the soil out of the way and see if there's any insect evidence in here.
By looking at the larvae and their development, it's possible to estimate how long a body has been at the scene.
The white ones that you can see, which are still moving, so these are larvae or maggots, and these are no longer feeding, so they've moved off the body. As you can see, they're still burrowing down into the soil. And then you've also got some darker ones here, which are no longer moving. These are now starting to pupate.
Samples from the scene are then taken back to the lab for further analysis.
You want to preserve your larvae in the stage at which they're found at the scene, because you're effectively stopping the clock at that point. Different species develop at different rates. So you really need to look at the insects under a microscope in order to be able to identify them correctly. Under the microscope, I've got some Califera vomitoria. So this is the species that was found in the Shophelia armid case. So this is a relatively common blue bottle blowfly species. And these ones are active mainly from spring through to autumn.
By examining the insects, Amorette could begin to determine how long the body had been lying in the field. But to get an accurate prediction, she also had to examine the weather. She could then scientifically plot exactly how long Shophelia had been there, almost to the day.
The colder it is, the slower they develop. The hotter it is, the faster they develop. Because the insects were kind of in the later stages of development, they were already in the pupal stage. So they're quite a long way through the life cycle. And because the temperatures had been quite cold, that meant that it had taken quite a long period of time for them to get to that stage. So from that, I was able to work out that the insects had been laid as eggs on the body fairly soon after Shophelia had gone missing.
Amorette had found Shophelia had died and been left in this field around the same time as she had been reported missing. It was the breakthrough the investigation had been waiting for.
By showing Shophelia was there soon after the 11th of September, it gives you a real opportunity to narrow down who was in her life at that period in time. And there was no one that we could find, really.
Shophelia's parents were the last people to see her alive, and now they were prime suspects in her murder. But there were already suspicions about Fazana and Iftika's treatment of their daughter.
Shophelia had been a victim of domestic abuse. She confided in close friends. She seemed to have quite a happy childhood, but once she got to sort of 13, 14, some pressure had been exerted on her, and certainly by the time she was doing her GCSEs, she was suffering domestic abuse. And she describes to her friends about, you know, getting locked in the house, about her mum holding her down, dad strangling her, all sorts of things going on. And that was reported. There was reports. The school really tried to help. Not much reported to the police.
This pattern of abuse is all too familiar to social justice campaigner Jasvinder Sangera. She believes Shafilia's parents were punishing her for pursuing a lifestyle they didn't approve of.
It is deemed shameful to integrate, it is deemed shameful to do a number of normal adolescent things as dishonourable. When I speak from personal experience, somebody who was born in the UK, raised within a Sikh family, I was taught that I couldn't do certain things because it was deemed shameful. So my parents would say to me, this is culture, this is our culture, this is part of our tradition, even part of our religion. And as a young person, I believed that because these were my parents. So only when I got older did I understand, actually, this is not cultural. This is not part of my tradition. It's important for people to understand, and especially professionals, that they deal with these issues as abuse and not part of culture.
Following an inquest, the coroner concluded Shafilia had definitely been murdered.
The conclusion of the coroner was that this was a homicide by hand of someone else, and he called it a vile murder. He also made a narrative around, you know, he believes that this death was a result of something close to home.
Shafilia's parents strongly denied they had killed their daughter and believed they were under suspicion because of their race.
Her parents claim that they've been treated differently just because they're an Asian family.
They went live on television to say that the police were biased and they were using ethnic stereotyping, basically. Shrouded word for racism, maybe, or whatever, or accusing us of just stereotyping the family as people from a certain culture that have killed their daughter.
As the news conference ended, Shafilia's parents suddenly appeared, unannounced. A solicitor spoke on their behalf.
They strenuously deny any direct or indirect involvement in their daughter's untimely demise. If called upon to do so, they will not hesitate to defend their good and unblemished names in any court in this land.
We don't believe that we've been treated fairly, but I'm as English as anybody can picture me, right? But obviously the police portrayal of me is different.
When they accused Cheshire Police of being racist, they were hiding behind that culture, trying to use that as a reason to get the police to go on the back foot or to look the other way, to make them feel fearful that they were treading on cultural toes. And that is a real problem.
Amoret Whitaker's evidence proved a time of death when only Shafilia's parents could have been responsible, and the investigation had found evidence of domestic abuse. But this wasn't enough to bring a prosecution. For another 2 years, the investigation remained a stalemate, until a shock confession cracked the case open.
The sister of Shafilia Ahmed, the teenager from Warrington allegedly murdered by her parents over 8 years ago, has spoken of her relief for telling police what happened. Alicia Ahmed says she witnessed the killing, but kept it secret because she loved her parents.
I'd moved on as a superintendent by then. I had to step back a little bit and let someone else then bring the evidence through to court. Even though I was very emotionally attached to the case, another senior officer was then brought in, mainly to focus as well around bringing the evidence from her sister into court to bolt onto the pre-existing evidence.
Shafilia's sister, Alicia, claimed she witnessed her parents choke Shafilia to death with a plastic bag after a row about how she was dressed. In August 2012, Iftikhar and Fazana Ahmed were convicted of their daughter's murder. They were each sentenced to 25 years. Without Amoret Whitaker's expertise, this case might have never made it to the courts.
Normally, when you do a murder trial, you have a lineup of different experts, one after the other, going in to give evidence. With this, we had a pathologist and an entomologist giving evidence in Crown Court. And it became very important because we could put Shafilia there. We could put her at that scene, and we could put her there early on after her disappearance.
It certainly shows the value of forensic entomology. I am very pleased that the evidence that I gave did make a big contribution to the case.
Shafilia's case also shone a light on abuse within families, sometimes missed by authorities.
There's the National Day of Memory now, which is on Shafilia's birthday every year. And, you know, Shafilia's legacy is around making things safer for other people.
This young girl, this 17-year-old girl that had everything to live for, was put on the floor by her mother and father, held down and suffocated to death while the siblings watched. Now, the reason they're referred to as honour killings, and we have to recognise this, is because the mother and father saw Shafilia not as a victim, but as a perpetrator and somebody who has dishonoured the family. And that's why they call it an honour killing. To reclaim their honour, they murdered their daughter. We have to acknowledge it was honour related, but they are dishonourable killings because there is no honour in killing anyone.
Fraudsters and forgers are getting more sophisticated all the time, and more sophisticated in terms of the detail that they will go into.
(1999). In London's art world, a wave of paintings by a Victorian artist called John Anster Fitzgerald is beginning to hit the market. Journalist Georgina Adam remembers the crime only too well.
John Anster Fitzgerald was a Victorian period painter, quite self-taught. He was really rather outside the mainstream, and he's particularly noted for paintings of fairies. He became a well-known painter, and his works of art can fetch up to £500,000 today.
Rupert Mass is a well-respected art dealer. He was offered a painting entitled The Miser, apparently by John Anster Fitzgerald.
I thought it was absolutely marvellous, called The Miser. And of course the fairies are stealing his money, it's his worst nightmare.
The man selling it was Robert Thwaite, and he had a plausible reason for wanting to part with the painting.
He said that the painting had belonged to his family and had come into his family as a result of a settlement of a debt.
But Rupert had some concerns and didn't buy the painting right away.
There was something about it that didn't quite ring true, that the colour particularly, and also the surface had a very, very thick layer of varnish on it.
Rupert consulted an art restorer who said he believed the picture was genuine. So Rupert snapped it up for £20,000. Not long afterwards, a second painting, Going to the Masked Ball, also attributed to Fitzgerald, appeared on the market. It fetched nearly £100,000 at auction.
It was bought by another reputable dealer. He didn't think it was in very good condition. He paid £100,000 for it all the same. So he took it to a restorer.
The painting appeared to have been touched up over the years. This is not unusual, and restorers will often remove the layers of new paint to reveal the original work beneath.
And when the restorer started taking off some of the overpainting, it was at that point that they realised that it actually had a lot of problems.
The restorer began to suspect the painting could be a fraud. To find out for sure, he sent the work to art detective and expert witness, Dr. Nicholas Eastor, for scientific analysis.
When you come to look at an artist, even if you haven't looked at them before, the range of materials are going to be dictated by the time and the place. By the time you get to the 19th century, when you have an artist like Fitzgerald, there's a big explosion in chemistry and systematic production of pigments that's using new kinds of technologies.
Nicholas began his investigation by analysing samples of paint. He was looking for pigments that weren't used or hadn't been invented when Fitzgerald was alive.
The process from here is a very systematic one. Sampling is done under a microscope because you can't take those very, very small samples without a microscope. We followed our usual approach and sampled lots of different colours, and we can see there's several sorts of reds and whites and greens.
But it was the artist's choice of yellow paint that caught Nicholas's eye. John Anster Fitzgerald is known to have used a blend of pigments particular to his time.
It's actually commonly called Naples yellow, composed of lead and antimony. And this was quite widely used in the 19th century as sort of a mid-yellow colour. but because of the cost of it, it became substituted later on by alternatives.
Nicholas carried out a microscopic analysis of the yellow paint and spotted an anomaly.
There was a nickel titanium yellow compound, which we were able to identify in one of the yellow colours. And this is a compound that was not introduced until the 20th century, well after Fitzgerald had died.
On its own, this clue did not prove the work was a forgery. The modern yellow paints may have been added as part of a touch-up by a well-meaning restorer later in the painting's life. So Nicholas looked for further evidence of a modern restoration.
We'll be examining it under ultraviolet light. Once we've done that, we'll start getting it under a microscope so that we can look in more detail at the surface to look for things like, has the signature been added? Sometimes we take x-rays of paintings and that type of thing to help us.
But Nicholas could find no further evidence of a modern restoration and began to suspect the conspicuous yellow paint was the result of a slip-up by a skilled forger.
There was no evidence that it was part of any later campaign of restoration. It points to a common error. People go and try and find historical materials. They think they're buying one thing and they're actually getting another.
But before he wrote off the work as a complete fake, Nicholas had one more examination to make.
In this case, it's useful to be able to compare to the works of the artists themselves. Do you find the same materials? Do you find the same painting techniques? Do you find the same kinds of appearance?
Nicholas needed to be sure his scientific findings were backed up by a centuries-old method of detecting forgeries, connoisseurship, or the knowledge of how an artist paints.
You could see that Fitzgerald habitually was drawing. These fake Fitzgeralds didn't have that. The genuine Fitzgeralds had these crisp details applied, and the fakes didn't. So you were seeing these concrete, demonstrable features of technique where they were quite different.
Nicholas's analysis left him in no doubt. Going to the masked ball was a forgery, and it appeared the forger was still at large when a third Fitzgerald painting hit the market.
This time, this was a fairy on a poppy. It was smaller. It had exactly the same problems, again, slightly suspicious circumstances of sale and the colour and the surface. The point was this time, when I saw that, I thought, this painting is wrong.
Nicholas was asked to give his opinion. He immediately had concerns.
The absence of the drawing, the diffuse quality of the paint, the absence of the kind of crisp details of Fitzgerald's paintings, that it was going to fit in most likely to the forged works.
Attention now turned again to The Miser, the first painting bought by Rupert Mass for £20,000. A closer assessment of this work now revealed it too was a forgery. 3 Fitzgerald paintings, all forged. Police began an inquiry led by senior investigator Michelle Roycroft. She began with a call to the man who had sold the first painting, Robert Thwaites.
He had an early morning call from the Art and Antiques unit, and very quickly we found his studio, which was in a barn at the back of his home address, and it was like walking into an Aladdin's cave.
Thwaites was a graphic designer, but he obviously had another talent. Michelle found his workshop crammed with the tools and materials for forging artworks.
There were Victorian paints, there were books including Eric Hepburn's The Forger's Handbook, there were pieces of cutting of old Victorian newspaper, and whilst flicking through one of the notebooks, I came across a photograph of a poppy, which was an exact match for the poppy which appeared in the centre of the third painting to come onto the art market, The Poppies with Imps and Fairies.
It was clear to Michelle she was standing in a forger's studio, and clear that Thwaites had a lot of explaining to do. Incredibly, he confessed to forging all 3 artworks: The Miser, Going to the Masked Ball, and Poppy with Imps and Fairies.
Robert Thwaites, who was in his 50s, and it's really a very sad story because Robert Thwaites had had a blameless life up until then. He was a graphic designer, but he was not doing well financially. He was in debt. He decided to forge these paintings in order to try to make some money, clear his debts. And he was, of course, a very talented painter as well.
At trial in 2006, Robert Thwaites pleaded guilty to the deception and was sentenced to 2 years in prison.
I'm proud of the work that we did. I would like to think that the evidence that we uncovered did lead to the admission of guilt in this case.
The problem with forgery is that it actually corrupts art history as well. It's very bad from the public point of view because it undermines trust in dealers, in auction houses, and indeed in the artist's work itself.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, we reveal how analysis of soil finally brought some justice to the grieving family of Becky Godden.
If they can solve a cold case back 2003, then there's hope.
And we discover how a tiny stone was the key to solving a shocking attack in Greater Manchester.
It was a bingo moment. We knew it was definitely that shoe that did it.
Soil that has been recovered many decades ago can be opened and secrets revealed. One day we were approached by a police officer with a spade and said, "Can you help us work out where that soil on the spade came from?"
Swindon, 2003. Becky Godden is seen for the last time. She is just 20 years old. Becky was born in 1983. Her mum, Karen, remembers her childhood fondly.
Oh, she was a lovely little girl, really vibrant and very popular, had lots of friends. And then there's a picture here when she was bridesmaid at my wedding. She'd already started her struggle in this one. You wouldn't think so to look at her, though. She was bullied at school, and that led to a spiral in her life. And the next thing we knew, she was taking drugs. She left home, then she'd come back, and then she'd go, and then she'd ring me up, she'd be in trouble, then she'd come back again.
Over her teenage years, Becky's contact with her family became less frequent until 2003, when it stopped entirely.
So she was gone for a very long time. I used to say to my mum, do you think she's all right, Mum? Do you think she'll ever come home? And she said, she'll come home one day. But of course, she never come home.
Becky had been missing for 8 years when in 2011, police began investigating the disappearance of another young woman from Swindon.
A taxi driver has been charged with the murder of Sian O'Callaghan, the 22-year-old whose body was found in Oxfordshire on Thursday.
What Karen didn't know is that Sian's disappearance would also hold the key to finding her daughter, Becky.
CCTV captured her walking towards the headlights of a minicab. She was never seen alive again.
Detectives quickly identified and arrested the prime suspect in Sian's disappearance. Sean Memory was part of the investigation team.
Christopher Halliwell was a taxi driver in Swindon, but he'd had a long criminal history from the 80s of burglary and theft, and he knew the Swindon area very, very well. When Christopher Halliwell was arrested, he didn't want to speak. However, he was taken to an isolated location because there was some thought that Sian could still be alive. At that point, he decided to confess that he'd taken and killed Sian, and he took the officers to a location called Uffington and pointed out where Sian was.
At that moment, the investigation took a remarkable turn.
As they were just about to leave there, he said, "Would you like another one? I'll take you to another body."
Detectives suddenly found themselves in a very difficult position. Halliwell's words were in effect a confession to a different crime. The detective in charge was Steve Fulcher.
Steve Fulcher was in a really difficult position because when you get arrested, you're supposed to be taken to a police station where you're entitled to free legal advice. When someone says to you, "Do you want another one?" would the normal person just take them back to the police station? Most people would say, "Well, what are you talking about? Tell me."
He and I were in a particular moment together. Any intervention at that time could have broken that momentary bond, and he could have changed his mind.
Steve Fulcher was worried that if he did not act straight away, Halliwell might change his mind and the other body might never be found. So he let Halliwell lead him to a field in Gloucestershire, and there, Halliwell revealed the shallow grave where Becky Godden was buried.
In some ways, this is the perfect burial site. There's not a house in view. It's extremely quiet, and even today, if a car comes, we can hear it from several miles away. I'm almost certain that if Becky had not been found by Christopher Halliwell's assistants back in 2011 when he made the admissions, she would almost certainly would have been still here. Definitely meant that the family had some closure and Becky was found.
There was a knock on the front door, and my son went to answer it. And it still hurts today. I just had that gut feeling. Even though I'd convinced myself that it was Becky, when you're actually told it, your whole world is just completely shattered.
Halliwell was arrested for the murders of both Sian O'Callaghan and Becky Godden, but there was a problem.
You don't really know the law. You just assume that they've got them, they'll trial them, they'll put them away. But of course it wasn't as simple as that.
Because Halliwell had not been brought straight into a police station after his arrest for Sian's murder, his confession to killing Becky was deemed inadmissible in court, and the case against him for Becky's murder never went to trial.
It wasn't until really after Sian's hearing that I knew then that I had to ask everybody for help. And I remember standing on those steps and asking the media for their help.
I would like the full support of you all to help me get justice for my daughter Becky. Thank you.
In 2015, the police began a new investigation into Becky's murder. It was led by Sean Memory.
I just wanted justice. I thought it was grossly unfair that Christopher Halliwell had not been convicted of this offence.
Sean knew that this time, the case against Halliwell needed to be built not on his confession, but on brand new forensic evidence. He was convinced this field held the key. So he turned to soil analyst and expert witness, Lorna Dawson.
It needed some objective evidence, something that was different, something that could be quantified on the basis of reliable evidence.
Sean began with a complete re-examination of all the evidence gathered during the initial investigation.
So in 2003, when he killed Becky Godden, he was living here. When this house was searched, several thousand items were seized, from bedding, clothing, everything in the garage, his bedroom, kitchen, bathroom. So I would imagine probably 2,000 or 3,000 exhibits came from this address.
But among the thousands of exhibits, one in particular caught Sean's eye, one which might, with Lorna Dawson's expertise, prove Christopher Halliwell was guilty of the murder of Becky Godden.
We're currently outside the house Christopher Halliwell lived at when he murdered Sean O'Callaghan, and this is where the search took place.
Sean was determined to build his case on forensic evidence, and one item they found would prove crucial.
When the shed here was searched, there were several items found, but critically, the spade with the soil on it was recovered. The spade itself just looked an old spade. It had a red handle, it was rusty, it wasn't a modern spade. And the soil was actually located in the join of the handle and the metal bit at the rear. It was stuck like concrete to the back of the spade.
Sean had a hunch this caked mud could have come from Halliwell digging Becky Godden's grave. It was a long shot, but photos of the field itself gave him hope.
This is sadly the deposition site, and you can see how hard the soil is and how shallow the grave was. It's a sad picture to look at because Becky was only buried 6 inches down. It's a really shallow grave. If you look at the colour of the soil and if you look at the aerial photo, that particular field is almost unique in that area, let alone anywhere else in the country. So a stroke of luck for the investigation that Christopher Halliwell chose that field to bury Becky.
Sean needed to put his hunch to the test, so he turned to expert witness and forensic soil analyst Lorna Dawson.
So we received the individual samples from these tools, and we examined them, we looked at them, we described them for colour and texture.
Well, when we put it under the microscope, we are looking for any plant material, fibre, any unusual features. At this stage, you don't know what you're going to see in your sample under the microscope. Here we've got some grains, we've got some graphite, we've got these aggregates which are all quite similar to each other.
We can narrow it down to the aggregates on these tools, and we then take them through the process for the organic characterisation.
Lorna's next step was to analyse the constituent parts of the soil in even greater detail.
This is a gas chromatograph. Gas chromatography is where the materials that we are looking to quantify are separated out. What happens with this is we change the compounds into vapours, so they become gases. They are then heated up in this column within the machine. They're separated by mass or size. And the detector part allows us to quantify how much of each of these compounds is in each sample. This was an orangey yellow soil, so it was quite distinctive. And the fact it was a corner of a field, it was quite unusual in its characteristics. So what we've got on this trace, green sample is the sample from the spade. And then we've got the pink line here, which is the sample from the grave where Becky Godden was found. They are very similar. How much is in of each of the compounds from the field and from the sample from the spade.
Firstly, I didn't know whether the soil from the back of the shovel would have come from that field. That in itself would be quite remarkable that he used that particular shovel to bury Becky Godden. So we waited patiently for several weeks, and then I got that golden nugget moment and a phone call from Lorna. And she was able to say to me that a couple of the samples effectively were a direct match to the spade. And when we looked at those exhibits, They were the samples that were removed from the deposition site at Becky's body.
This compelling new soil evidence meant Christopher Halliwell could at last be tried for Becky Godden's murder. A date was set for the trial. It was the moment Becky's mum, Karen, had been waiting for. But Christopher Halliwell was now protesting his innocence. After all these years, it seemed he might escape justice again.
Even though you longed for that day, for that conviction, because let's face it, you have a trial. It was trial by jury. And then they've got to go away and they've got to make their mind up. So you go through all of that. You are really on tenterhooks all the time.
The jury took just 2 hours to find Halliwell guilty. He was then sentenced to life in prison.
It's never going to bring Becky back. Never. Nothing's going to bring her back. But she'd have the justice that she rightly deserved.
After years of legal wrangling, it was Lorna's soil science that finally delivered justice.
Lorna Dawson's absolutely fantastic, and without her use on this investigation, I don't think we would have solved it. And her knowledge and the way she explained it was just first class.
Science and technology had been developing that we were able to use to be able to show that the material on those tools had come from that location.
I think it's vital to not give up on these cases. Just because someone has been convicted and served life imprisonment, there's no closure for Becky's family. All they wanted to know and hear was someone to say that Christopher Halliwell was responsible for murdering their daughter.
Let me tell you, if they can solve a cold case back 2003, then there's hope. There's hope for all those other parents out there, or people that are waiting for their loved one to come home. There's hope. And Lorna, if I ever get the chance to meet her, I should give her the biggest hug and thank her for what she did. Yeah.
You might think that shoe treads are the same for a certain brand, but sometimes when you zoom in, you might find something that makes that unique. I would find sometimes patterns that other people would miss.
Droylsden, Greater Manchester, 2004. A 53-year-old man is found dead in his house. It looks like he has been beaten. Ruth Tully is a criminal psychologist who took a keen interest in the case.
Domestic violence is a huge problem in the UK. It's often a hidden problem, but it's one where I see perpetrators on a day-to-day basis. Vigilante attacks like this, thankfully, are very rare, but putting justice in their own hands clearly had devastating consequences for everybody concerned here. It was Easter Sunday. William Wilson, known as Billy, and his brother Anthony were out drinking in Droylsden and they bumped into their mother's ex-partner. There were allegations that he tried to strangle her around a year before, so it was clear that there was bad blood between them all.
In fact, witnesses at a local pub remembered seeing Anthony and Billy Wilson arguing with the victim before Anthony knocked him unconscious. A few days later, the man was found dead at his home. It was a shocking scene.
The scene was very bloody, as though something very violent had gone on. Not just dead, but mutilated as well.
The police carried out a forensic examination of the property, searching for DNA of both Anthony and Billy Wilson. But, as retired detective Roy Lambert knows well, the presence of their DNA would not be enough to prove they were there on the day of the murder.
The public think DNA is the silver bullet, but it's not. These types of offences bring their own problems, because when strangers are not involved, somebody may have visited the scene or the house where the victim was found in legitimate circumstances and left their DNA there. It's very important when you're building a case to know what the context of the DNA is. So it's where it was found, whose DNA is it, what access did they have to the premises, what access did they have to the victim.
There was one piece of evidence, though, that investigators were convinced could hold the key. So they called on forensic imaging expert Derek Tremaine.
There was a hand mark on the stairs on wallpaper. The handprint was in blood.
But when Derek was sent the piece of blood-stained wallpaper, he realised it wasn't going to be that easy.
The bloody handprint on the wallpaper had already been to forensics, and when I received it, it was like a piece of dish rag, to tell you the truth, and I couldn't do much with it.
The investigation was going nowhere, but Derek was not about to give up.
I was speaking to the officer on the case, and I said to him, you know, is there anything else? He said there was some footwear marks on his back.
Forensic investigators thought the footprint-shaped bruising on the victim's body was too small to belong to Billy or Anthony Wilson. But Derek wasn't so sure.
They're not experts in looking at injuries like we are, and they had sized it on a mark. It was quite a deep-looking bruise.
Derek was more interested in the more superficial bruising closer to the surface of the skin. This is known as intradermal bruising.
Deep bruising is more amorphous, and it also can spread. Intradermal bruising can leave very fine detail. It's very important when you're looking at something to look at the intradermal.
Derek now began a new analysis of the footprints, hoping to find something that others had missed.
It is puzzle solving all the time. There's a block there. You can see there's rings going down there, and there's some more parts of rings there. If you push down on your skin and lift it, it goes white. Now, what happens when a shoe hits it on and off like that? That blood gets displaced out quickly. So you might get areas of blanching either side. If someone's alive, after a time, very quickly it will repair itself. But if someone's dead, the heart's not beating, and then it will stay there.
It was clear to Derek that there were injuries that had been caused by an attacker stamping on the victim's back. Now he wanted to compare the pattern of the bruising to the tread of the shoes worn by Anthony and Billy Wilson.
When I got the images of the shoes through, I could quite simply see that they had all these rings and shapes. As soon as I saw them, I got very excited and thought that, you know, there could be a match here.
Derek was convinced the bruises were a match with a trainer worn by Billy Wilson, but that's not enough for a jury. Derek needed to provide proof.
So then I performed an overlay using the trainers. I made the trainer the same size as the injuries here, using the scales here, and then I put on several layers of the shoes in different positions. So you can then fade the layer in and out to see if it's made that mark or not. When I sized them, they matched completely.
For the first time, police had evidence that identified the killer as Billy Wilson. But the tread pattern on Wilson's shoes was very common, so could have been worn by anyone. Derek needed to find evidence to link the bruises to the specific pair of trainers worn by Billy Wilson.
Footwear is good evidence, but it's only good evidence if you can find the right boot or shoe. If you're lucky, as an investigator, it will be an unusual type of footwear, maybe an imported shoe or boot, but it also may have on the tread unique imperfections or unique features.
Shoes have all got the same tread mark, you know, a certain brand of shoes, but sometimes there may be something on that shoe that will make it unique.
This was what Derek now needed to find, and he began a minute examination of the tread on Billy Wilson's shoe.
I could see that there was a tiny abrasion in the intradermal bruise, which is just here. There's these tiny abrasions here, and when I overlaid the shoe, it came up exactly with a small stone that was trapped in the treads. Yeah, it was a bingo moment.
This tiny stone was exactly what Derek was looking for.
Obviously, a stone trapped in the shoe, making a mark, would make it unique. But the chances of another shoe having a stone in it in exactly the same place is pretty impossible. So we knew it was definitely that shoe that did it.
Expert witness Derek Tremaine had found evidence to lead police to the feet of the victim's killer. Billy Wilson was charged with murder, his brother Anthony for assault. The pair stood trial in 2005.
Because he was attacked so viciously, the offenders could not say it was done by an accident. Now, if you commit serious injury and the person dies as a result of those serious injuries, and you intended to commit the serious injuries, that's enough intent to prove murder. It's not accidental. You intended, and you should have foreseen the fact that if you inflict these injuries, there was a distinct possibility the person would die. And that's what happened.
The jury found Billy Wilson guilty of murder. He was given a life sentence. His brother Anthony admitted assaulting the victim in the pub. He was given 2 years.
The jury heard lots and lots of gruesome evidence and circumstantial evidence in this case, but eventually it was a tiny, tiny stone in Wilson's shoe print that proved crucial. It's amazing how cases can turn on the tiniest bit of evidence.
If I hadn't have asked to look at it, it may very well have slipped through the net. Because I've been in forensic medicine so long, I said, let me have a look at the rest of the images, and I could quite easily see that, you know, these were pretty useful. It's great to be working on a case like this where obviously you help solve a murder as brutal as this one.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, how the work of 2 expert witnesses proved crucial in solving the notorious murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.
They used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Everybody, I think, was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
And how advances in forensic science allowed one expert witness to identify the killer in a murder cold case.
It was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case, 16 years on from the murder.
When we use forensic geology, we look at the details of the rock and often the soil that's involved in the case. There are quite a number of techniques we can use that enables us to produce a really unique result that will match a suspect to a crime scene.
When I go to a crime scene, it's everything. It's the soil itself, the vegetation, the amount of light, the creepy crawlies that are there. It all builds up to a picture, and one can get an enormous amount of information for the police.
August 2002, Cambridgeshire. 2 young girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, are reported missing from a family barbecue. Like many of us, crime journalist Ron K. Phillips still remembers the case 20 years later.
Once their families realised they were missing and they'd been reported to the police, there was a really intensive search to find them. And they used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Local people joined the hunt. It really, everybody, I think, felt and was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
This evening, there were countless volunteers assembled outside the girls' school.
An image taken the very day Holly and Jessica went missing now filled TV screens across the country.
The thing that's incredibly poignant is the photograph was taken just hours before they went missing. They were at a family barbecue having a wonderful time, and a few hours later, well, you know what happened.
Former Assistant Chief Constable Alan Mains conducted a review of the case for Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service. He studied every detail of the hunt for Holly and Jessica.
The team on the ground were overwhelmed, I think, by the media attention. They need to get the message out, and as an investigator, we would use the media quite a bit to get our message out, to get sort of appeals out, and it's been very, very productive. So, but there's a balance to that, and the world descended onto Soame over the next couple of days after the 4th of August. And that was hard to manage. It really is, the sort of first 4 to 6 hours is your golden opportunity to get them back safely. When it sort of goes beyond that, then you really do have to start working through the worst case scenario.
Less than 2 weeks later, the girls' bodies were discovered by walkers in woodland 20 miles from their home.
It was the news the nation had been dreading. The discovery of 2 bodies in thick woodland next to the RAF base at Lakenheath.
In the interim between the girls going missing and the recovery of their bodies, the investigation team had really pulled together a core group of experts, and even that, they were bringing a lot of value to the team. They were starting to make sure that the information that they were getting was properly assembled.
Forensic ecologist Patricia Wiltshire was among that team and attended the crime scene.
When I got there, lots of people, lots of police officers, lots of people dressed up in white, with the press in adjacent fields with their cherry pickers. You feel very exposed, but it wasn't very pleasant. But of course, the crime scene is critically important. That's where you're going to pick up clues as to who's been there. So you have to take your time. The police wanted to know when the girls had been put into the ditch, Well, at a quick look at the vegetation that had obviously been, I found the path, it had been trampled. I could see what had happened. But of course, that's not good enough. You really need to corroborate that.
For Patricia, trampled nettles found at the scene of the crime were key to calculating when the bodies were left there. So she designed an innovative experiment.
We set up a scenario at a local field centre where they were in a very protected place where there were banks of nettles, and the warden actually walked in with heavy weight on his back twice. And then he photographed those nettles every day. And we watched their recovery. And they behaved exactly as the nettles did at the site. And after about 12.5 days, we got the same number of nodes, the same sort of distances between the nodes. So I said to the police, that confirms it's about 2 weeks. And they were shocked because it was exactly 12.5 days that the girls had disappeared and then they were found.
Patricia's experiment showed the girls' bodies had been placed there shortly after they'd gone missing. Meanwhile, the investigation had identified a prime suspect, Ian Huntley.
Whenever the police are at the early stages of an investigation, they rule nothing in or nothing out. So everybody potentially is a suspect until they are no longer. And that's the way you have to have an open mind. I think Huntley became very much to the fore in a lot of the media, and indeed in the searches as well. He was putting himself up there as somebody who was trying to help.
28-year-old Ian Huntley was a caretaker at the local school. His manner with the detectives and inquisitiveness about the case caught the attention of the investigation.
One of the community safety police officers came in to work. Huntley came up and started to chat to her. She was very, very good to sort of suss and think, you know, that's a bit suspicious, asking about how long does DNA last for. And she reported it back into the command and control, and somebody there sensed it as suspicious and then started to escalate from there.
Police interviewed Huntley. He lived nearby and said he had spoken to the girls the day they had disappeared. Detectives searched his home.
Police officers noted a strong smell of cleaning substance, and that automatically pulled your suspicions right up there. And the washing on the line, when it was raining, all the things that people wouldn't do in the ordinary course of their everyday events. And this was something that they had to look at closer.
Police began a forensic investigation of Huntley's house and his car. In both, they discovered red fibres matching the football shirts worn by Holly and Jessica when they disappeared. But Huntley had an explanation.
He then comes up with this story that they come in with a nosebleed. And that's all, you know, that's very credible in the sense that it happens. And the fact that he was at the school, there might have been a common bond, knowing them and being familiar, and more importantly, being at ease with them. It's the investigators that have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, not Mr. Huntley. It's like a strand on a rope. The more strands you can get, the thicker the rope is, and the more evidence that you would gain to bring it before a court and before a jury. And therefore, if you were just taking it on fibre evidence, you would have to really make sure that whatever he said is rebutted.
Detectives continued their hunt for more evidence. They searched the school where Huntley worked and found some upsetting evidence. Patricia Wiltshire analysed the football shirts for clues to how they got there.
All embedded in that clothing were bits of vegetation, particularly the fruits of alder trees that were hanging over that ditch very densely. And so the alder fruits and other things told me straight away that the girls had been clothed when they were in the ditch.
The red fibres at his house and the football shirts at his place of work were incriminating evidence against Huntley. But neither placed him at the location where the bodies had been hidden. For that, police turned to expert witness and forensic geologist Andrew Moncrief.
If you don't have any evidence linking a suspect to a murder victim after they've been killed, then you've not really got that all-important link, because contact while they're still alive can be explained in all sorts of ways, as it could in this case. And you really do need that link very often with the body deposition site.
Police had possession of Ian Huntley's car. Now they asked Andrew to look for evidence that could link it to the crime scene.
I did what I would always do, which is first of all to go to the site in question and see what's there. As I walked down the track and started digging a trial pit down through it, I really did get quite excited, because I could see that we were dealing, amongst many other things, with chalk. And chalk is extremely valuable forensically. Chalk itself is very widespread in the British Isles, one of the most common rocks on the surface. And the lovely thing about it is it contains millions upon millions of very, very tiny fossils. And those fossils have been used extensively to date the rock very, very accurately. So you know exactly where you are within the chalk.
Andrew took samples of the chalk for analysis and then turned to Huntley's car. If it had traces of chalk matching the location where the girls' bodies were found, then Andrew could place Huntley at the scene of the crime.
You can find geological samples all over a car. You'll obviously find material on the tyres, very often sprayed up onto the wheel arch, maybe up the side if a car's been stuck in a muddy area. The problem with all of those things is that they are not one-off events. The wheel arch of a car will have material in it from hundreds of miles of driving. Likewise, if you find a fragment of rock lodged in a tread of a tyre, how do you know where it came from? It could have been picked up from almost anywhere. The beauty about the deposits that I found on Ian Huntley's car was where they were. They were lying on the top of the front left suspension arm. Now, that's not a place where you would commonly find material lodged. It had to have been picked up in a single event by the car being driven over a pile of rocky soil and taking the top off, a bit like a boiled egg, if you like. So it represented a single event. We had a sample uncontaminated by any other locality. It had got in the car on one occasion, and one occasion only, and that made it very powerful.
Andrew sent the chalk samples from the car and the crime scene for analysis.
Lo and behold, in very short order, back came the results. They were all exactly the same.
But Andrew needed to go even further and prove beyond doubt that there was nowhere else Huntley's car could have picked up chalk matching the crime scene.
The last thing you need to do in this sort of exercise is often what we call control sampling. You have to go out and actively look to see if you can't find this stuff somewhere else. We know it can't have come from further south than Cambridge, because it was the wrong type of chalk. It was the wrong colour, the wrong hardness. We know it can't have come from north of King's Lynn. Once again, wrong type of rock. Now, because the area is so low-lying and chalk is so soft, almost all of that is covered by fields, forests, roads, whatever. You don't see a lot of chalk outcropping when you drive around East Anglia. So really, you're looking for places where it's been dug up. And that means ditches, quarries, things like that.
Andrew and his team analysed chalk samples from dozens of such sites and even considered which were accessible in a Ford Fiesta. But they concluded the only possible match was the sites where the bodies were found. Police now had evidence tying Huntley to the crime scene.
First of all, a bit mind-blowing to the investigation team to prove absolutely beyond doubt that that's what it was in terms of the chalk and to the site and whatever else. That's just fantastic work. It really is fantastic, and it just illustrates the very important part that the scientists play.
Detectives charged Huntley with the double murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. His trial began in November 2003 at the Old Bailey in London.
The trial, just like the search for the girls, attracted not just nationwide attention, but worldwide attention. Everybody just holding their breath and wanting to know what the outcome would be.
You go up in there and you take the oath, or you affirm, or whatever it is, and you look up. And there's all these journalists whose faces you recognise from the television. And it takes quite a moment to settle down and to think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it.
Both Andrew and Patricia explain their evidence to the court. It had an immediate effect on the trial.
Just after we'd given our evidence, the barrister stood up and said, "My client wishes to confess."
Following Huntley's last-minute guilty plea, he was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 40 years.
I am proud that it made a difference. I think it's probably true that the geological work on the investigation was important. Forensic geology doesn't work well that often. But if it was going to ever work, I'm so glad it worked well on that case.
Roy Green is a forensic scientist who specialises in using DNA to solve cold cases, but it's not always like you see in the movies.
Yeah, because of programs like CSI, people seem to think that there's the DNA and you can just test it and you know, yeah, it's his, and the case solved. It's so much more complicated than that.
(1983) Merseyside. 50-year-old Cynthia Bolshaw is discovered face down in her bath at her home in Heswall on the Wirral. Cynthia was a divorced mother of one who worked as a beautician. The press quickly dubbed the murder the Beauty in the Bath. Local crime journalist Mark Thomas covered the case as a young reporter.
Cynthia Bolshaw worked as a beautician at a fairly exclusive department store called Brown's in Chester. She had a fairly sort of glamorous background, and she also had quite an active social life to go with it, as was to emerge during the case.
Cynthia was living alone at this house in Heswall in 1983.
Cynthia's body was discovered by her sister and brother-in-law when they went to visit her. Were surprised to find that there was no answer. They went into the house and unfortunately found her body lying naked, face down, in the bath. This is Buffs Lane, Heswall, which is the scene of the murder. This is a fairly affluent, quite well-off area, sort of a leafy little suburb. It was not the kind of neighbourhood that really one associates with violent crime, and it came as quite a disturbing thing to happen in such a quiet community.
Police searched the house and recovered nightwear along with Cynthia's personal diary.
Cynthia's diary contained the names of over 200 men and details of the relationships that she'd had with them. So it provided a huge resource in terms of potential clues, and in some ways that presented, of course, a massive challenge, because it meant that all of these people had to be contacted and eliminated from the inquiry. It was one of the largest scale murder investigations that Merseyside police had ever done at the time. There were upwards of 100 officers actively engaged on it. They actually had a squad of detectives who became known as the Boyfriend Squad, whose job was only to go and interview all the various boyfriends that Cynthia had had to try and establish whether they had alibis for the night of the murder.
Detectives had hundreds of suspects, but one by one, they were eliminated and the case went cold. For the next 15 years, Merseyside police made annual appeals for information about Cynthia's murder, but got nowhere. Then, in 1998, advances in forensic science offered detectives new hope when they turned to expert witness Roy Green.
In 1983, DNA profiling hadn't been invented yet, but 15 years later, when I picked up this case, it certainly was. And so the main thrust of the examinations was to try and find something that might produce a profile which might have come from the offender.
The pathologist's report showed Cynthia had had sexual contact very soon before she died, and the original investigation had found a mark on Cynthia's nightwear. Detectives were convinced it had come from her killer, but could not reveal an identity.
They'd found some staining on the negligee and had carried out grouping tests, but it really hadn't been that informative. And the thinking was that really there wasn't anything left.
Now, Roy wanted to use modern DNA analysis to try to identify the killer. But there was a problem. The sample no longer existed.
Now, that item had been examined for semen. During that process, they'd found a stain and had cut it out, which is part of the normal forensic process at that time. And that had then been tested. But it wasn't there anymore.
Roy needed to think of a way to retrieve a new sample from the nightwear.
Part of the process for finding that body fluid is to wet the item with a spray and then apply blotting paper that's damp. The idea is you're looking for a chemical that's present in high quantities in that body fluid, and it's very hard water soluble, and it soaks into the blotting paper, and then when you spray it, it'll turn purple if that particular body fluid is there.
Roy considered the fabric around the edge of the hole left when the earlier sample was removed. Could this have absorbed some of the fluid needed to run a DNA test?
What we did was we cut around the hole and then put that in for profiling.
Despite the fact 15 years had passed and the original sample was missing, the process returned a profile.
Well, we were quite pleased we got a profile, but of course it didn't match anyone so, at the time. But that sparked the police into making a press appeal. Could anybody who knows anything about this case come forward and help them? Because they did have new evidence that might help solve it.
This time, the public appeal delivered a major breakthrough. One of the men mentioned in Cynthia's diary was John Taft, the director of a double glazing company. He'd been interviewed by police, but was ruled out as he had an alibi provided by his wife. Now, she was ready to provide new information.
The key witness who came forward was Barbara Taft, who by that point was Taft's ex-wife. They had split up by then and got divorced. She had been asked by her husband to basically provide him with an alibi for the night of the murder. He had told her that he had been at the house to do an unofficial double glazing job for her, but was worried that if he came forward and told the police that, then he would immediately become a suspect just because of him having been in the house on the day. In fact, and it may be a little bit of an omission in the investigation at the time, Barbara was never questioned by the police, so never got to make that decision of whether to tell the truth, or which was in fact that she'd been away at the time, or whether to back her husband's story. It was a huge breakthrough because suddenly Merseyside police had somebody who had definitely been at the house on the night when Cynthia was murdered, which was, you know, in itself a large step forward. So he instantly became a person of very significant interest to the investigation.
Police re-interviewed Taft. He maintained his innocence and even volunteered a DNA sample.
When we got the DNA result back from the negligee, the statistic it gave was 680,000 times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone related to him. But about that time, we were going to use a new DNA system, and we applied that system to a bit more of the extract, and the probability of that result was 160 million times. So the finding was 160 million times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone unrelated to him.
It was a huge breakthrough, and it was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case. 16 years on from the murder, here we suddenly had science providing an absolutely essential piece of evidence that was to lead to the conviction of a killer.
John Taft's alibi had been a fake, and his DNA had been detected at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and charged with Cynthia's murder.
The trial lasted for 10 days. Taft protested his innocence throughout. When he got to give his evidence, he did admit that he had been at Cynthia's house and that he had made love to her, which is something that he had not admitted for the full 16 years previously. His account was that when he left the house, she was alive and well.
I gave evidence in this case, and it was important to get across to the jury that the result we'd got was from semen, and that it was on an item that was at the scene of the crime, and therefore it was relevant, very relevant.
The jury were convinced by Roy's evidence. They found Taft guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
I think the jury got that one right. You do realise that whenever you provide a statement that it's just a small part of what the jury will hear, but in this particular case it was a pretty important evidence.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Domestic violence is a crime that should never be tolerated. Yet every week in England and Wales, 2 women are killed by a current or former partner. In this programme, we'll reveal how, in 2 separate cases, evidence from expert witnesses helped put 2 violent husbands where they belong, behind bars.
I've covered a lot of gruesome murder cases. Paul Hemming is without doubt one of the nastiest, conniving individuals that I've ever had the misfortune to come across.
And we'll reveal how another abusive partner thought he had outwitted the law, but hadn't reckoned on an expert witness.
There were 7 bone fragments, which contained cut and saw marks.
Forensic entomologists can help in an investigation in many different ways, and one of the prime ones is to try to estimate how long someone's dead. We're able to build up a picture of what happened to that person from the point of death until they were found, and this can play a big role in the investigation.
May 2016, Milton Keynes. 31-year-old Natalie Hemming is reported missing from the home she shared with her partner and 3 young children.
Natalie was my youngest sister. She was funny, she was kind, she was an amazing mum.
The day that it all happened, usual thing, I was on the school run. My mum phoned me and she said, I can't get hold of Natalie. And I said, well, she's at work, Mum, you know, she'll ring you when she finished. And she went, no, you don't understand, Jo, I haven't been able to get hold of her since she left my house on the Sunday. That instant, my stomach just dropped.
Investigative journalist Nick Britton covered the case.
2 days after Natalie went missing, her mother made the phone call to the police saying that her daughter hadn't been seen of or heard of, and this was very unusual for her. And she was extremely worried. Of course, at that stage, it was a missing persons inquiry.
Natalie's partner Paul told police that as soon as the children were in bed, she went to stay with a friend. But this did not sound likely to Natalie's family.
As a mum, I would never leave my children, and I would never just disappear without telling somebody. So the fact that she'd been gone for that long and she hadn't told me or Kerry or my mum where she was going firstly, that the fact that the children were just left. Everything about that is just wrong.
As police made further inquiries, they became increasingly suspicious of Natalie's partner, Paul.
He got caught out very quickly in the lie that she was with a friend, and the friend's name that he'd given, he didn't realise we knew her and had her number. So all of those kinds of things, I think it was very obvious to the police very quickly that something was very, very wrong.
The unusual element of this case is that, of course, it was a missing persons, but the police had suspicions very early on that Paul Hemming was responsible. And so it quite quickly turned from a missing persons case into a murder investigation, yet it was a murder investigation without a body. For the police, this presented a real problem because the clock was ticking. It's very difficult and very rare, actually, to get a conviction for murder without a body.
Police studied CCTV for clues both to Natalie's whereabouts and her husband's movements around the time she disappeared. But after 3 weeks, there was still no sign of Natalie.
That breakthrough came when a man was out mowing some grass, just mowing a meadow. He smelled something that he didn't like. He thought it was probably a dead animal. He had a look and he saw the bare legs of a human being. And that human being was Natalie Hemming.
All this time, Natalie's family had been waiting for news.
I had a missed call from our family liaison officer, and so did Kerry. And I remember we just looked at each other and said they found her. It was almost a relief, because 3 weeks of not knowing, it's that constant, you're sort of living on a knife edge, you know, you're waiting for your world to implode. And so getting that phone call, as horrific as it was, it suddenly felt like closure.
Now that she had been found, police needed to find out exactly how long Natalie had been dead.
In Natalie's case, this time frame is incredibly important because what we know is she was caught on CCTV on the Saturday night out with her boyfriend. She was last seen on Sunday, but then nothing. Police didn't know where she was. They didn't know where she had gone. Of course, Paul Hemming told the kids that she had just gone away.
If detectives could prove when she died, it could tie Paul Hemming to her disappearance and her death.
If the police know exactly how long the body has been there, it will really help them knit together their case from when the person was last seen alive.
Police began a forensic examination, but after 8 weeks, were still no closer to establishing a time of death. Until one of the team contacted expert witness Martin Hall, an insect specialist at the Natural History Museum.
It was actually a young scientist who I had mentored myself, so I knew that her collection of insects would be good. She came to the Natural History Museum and passed over the insect specimens, and I was able to begin my part of the investigation.
As an expert witness, Martin has a unique set of skills. When
someone dies, they immediately start to decompose, and The pathologist can use several clues to determine how long they've been dead in that sort of 3-day window after death. But there's a huge amount of variation between different bodies in that 3-day window, and beyond it, it's extremely difficult for a pathologist to determine a time of death. However, our insects can then take over and help us. They become almost the only tool that pathologists can use. The insect biological clock keeps ticking and can then become almost the only clue as to how long someone's been dead for.
Among the insect evidence were blowfly larvae recovered from Natalie's body and around the crime scene. To calculate a time of death, first Martin had to identify which species of blowfly he was dealing with.
The life cycles of all blowflies are very similar, so egg to larva to puparia to adult fly, but the rates of development can vary. So even between sister species of the bluebottle fly, there can be quite a big difference. So it's very important to get the identification correct if you want to get the timing right. The species of blowfly that we found on the body of the victim were bluebottle blowflies, and they were of two species, Calliphora vomitoria and Calliphora vicina. And it was quite interesting that vomitoria was the most abundant species. This is a more rural species in wooded areas.
This was a crucial discovery. It allowed Martin to establish a timeline of events around Natalie's death.
So the fact that vomitoria was so dominant compared to vicina is consistent with the body having been placed at the scene soon after death rather than having been stored indoors for some time.
But detectives needed more. It was critical they could prove exactly when Natalie had been killed. While Martin continued his analysis, they looked more closely at their prime suspect, Paul Hemming.
When I first met him, honestly, he just seemed like a normal bloke. But then Natalie always said he had two faces. He had the face that we all saw and the face that she lived with.
During the 10 years that he and Natalie were together, it turned out that she had reported him to the police for domestic abuse. He had thrown a telephone at her head, cutting her head open, and then refused to take her to the hospital before assaulting her again. Eventually, when he did take her to the hospital, left her with the chilling words, "If you tell anybody about this, I will kill you." She did try to leave him.
Whenever their relationship had ended previously, it had always been in an argument or chaos. But this time it was planned, it was organised. She had, for the first time, really made the decision that this was it. She wasn't going back. It was all amicable, it was perfectly civil. He was going his way, she was going her way. It was the end of the relationship. I think it was a couple of months, she'd started talking to this guy at work, just a nice guy, and I think she suddenly realised that actually there are nice guys out there that don't do the things that were happening to her. And then that weekend, she'd spent the weekend with him.
Detectives now asked if Paul Hemming could have murdered Natalie on Sunday night when she returned to the family home. If expert witness Martin Hall could provide a time of death, they'd have their answer. Once again, it all hung on insect life from the crime scene.
So these specimen tubes contain larvae of Calliphora vicina, the bluebottle blowfly, and they look quite different in size. The ones here are much bigger and these are smaller, obviously, but they're actually the same age, 48 hours old. And it's just simply the fact that these ones here grew at 27 degrees and these ones here at 21 degrees. If you don't take into account temperature, then there's no way you can tell how old the insects are. In a way, unlike us, they don't just age in days, they age proportional to heat as well.
For that reason, Martin had to allow for the Great British weather while making his calculations.
So this is a typical data logger. Basically, they enable you to put the temperature recording device at the scene where the body was found, and then you can relate the temperatures from the data logger to those at a nearby weather station for the same period. You can then use the data from that nearby weather station to estimate what the actual scene temperatures would be. What this allowed us to do is then actually work out what temperatures the insects were experiencing and how fast they would develop. In this case, we knew we had Calliphora vomitoria larvae just about to pupariate on the 25th of May. We were able to determine that they must have been laid as eggs on the body in the period 2nd to the 5th of May. So our evidence that the insects must have found her body in the period 2nd to 5th of May confirmed that she must have died very soon after last being seen alive.
This new evidence now helped link Paul Hemming to Natalie's murder. And by piecing together the clues, the history of domestic violence, CCTV, mobile phone data, and other circumstantial evidence, detectives revealed what happened.
She had been out with her new boyfriend the night before, and she had returned on that Sunday evening to tell Paul Hemming that it was all over. She'd waited until the 3 kids were upstairs asleep in their bed, and then broken the news to him that she was leaving him. Hemming flew into a violent rage. He beat Natalie Hemming to death and then took her body, wrapped it in a rug, and buried it in woodland 30 miles away.
Police charged Paul Hemming with murder, preventing the lawful burial of a body and obstructing the coroner. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment.
I've written and covered a lot of gruesome murder cases and a lot of very bad individuals. Paul Hemming is without doubt one of the nastiest, conniving, destructive individuals that I've ever had the misfortune to come across. He still continued to deny it. He almost seemed to revel in it, this defiance, right to the end, even as he was being led to the cells, as he mouthed the words, "I enjoyed every minute," to Natalie's distraught family.
For Natalie's family, the work of the expert witnesses and police played a huge part in the verdict.
I'm massively grateful for all the work that they've done. And in terms of the police as well, I wish we'd had the opportunity to actually speak to all of them, because I know the dedication and hours that they put in, that, you know, some of them weren't going home and things to their own families so that our family had closure. You know, that's amazing.
It was curiosity that got me into science. So being confronted with a different type of evidence of this kind was interesting and a challenge in a way.
October 1999. Holbeck, Leeds. George Eckersley has reported his wife Denise missing. The events that followed caught the interest of criminal psychologist Ruth Tully.
George and Denise Eckersley had been married for 4 years and were planning a trip to Europe. However, just before they were due to go, George phoned the police and reported his wife missing.
Denise was nowhere to be found. The couple's car was missing. Denise's daughter from a previous marriage was getting anxious.
Denise Eckersley, who was 47 and had 4 children, was reported missing from her home in Holbeck in Leeds on October the 12th.
Police began to investigate and discovered CCTV footage of a woman who looked like Denise walking near the beach in Cleethorpes, nearly 80 miles away. But there was more to come.
Several days later, a letter arrived, seemingly from Denise, which basically said that she'd been unfaithful and couldn't go on. Even more worrying was that her belongings were found on a beach, along with a bottle of vodka.
Among Denise's belongings was a handbag containing a key to a locker at Cleethorpes railway station. There, police found a holdall packed with her clothing. It seemed Denise had run away and then taken her own life, just as the letter described. But not everyone was convinced.
Denise's daughter raised concerns about the handwriting in the letter, which she said was not her mother's.
Police continued their search for signs of Denise until the remains of human bones were discovered at a warehouse half an hour from the Eckersleys' home.
This industrial estate on the outskirts of Brighouse, just off the M62, is where the human remains have been found, but police haven't revealed the exact location.
The bones were discovered in the ashes of a bonfire at the premises. And most suspicious of all, it was the workplace of Denise's husband, George.
These events rocked the local community. George was well known and people believed him to be a kind-hearted man. They couldn't believe what had happened.
Denise Eckersley's disappearance was looking increasingly like murder, and her husband the prime suspect. But police had no idea if the bones in the ashes were actually Denise's. They needed an expert witness and turned to forensic osteologist Martin Everson.
The police brought in some fragments of bone and asked me to examine them. It seemed to me that some of these fragments very probably could have been human. So we asked the police to bring in the rest of the material. So over the next few days, they came in with half a dozen containers, and in total there were approaching 3,000 fragments of burnt bone, nearly all of them no bigger than the tip of your fingertip.
Martin spent the next few weeks sifting through the fragments.
I found a number of skeletal fragments that had to be human, phalanges, fingertips and toes, parts of the cranial bones that clearly had sutures.
Once he knew they were human remains, Martin began to build a profile of the victim.
There was nothing to suggest that this was a juvenile. They all appeared to be adult bones. They were all quite gracile, so this wasn't the skeleton of a robust male. This was a fine skeleton and therefore more likely to be female than male.
Martin next looked for evidence that could reveal more precise details about the victim's identity and made a breakthrough.
There were some molar roots of teeth that allowed some degree of age estimation of the remains, an adult, and a single porcelain premolar crown. Typically, the enamel crown is destroyed by heating. However, in this instance, there was a porcelain crown which had survived the burning process and could be compared with that of the missing person during life.
Dental records confirmed it was a match to Denise Eckersley. As Martin analysed the bones more closely, they began to reveal a chilling story of her death.
There were 7 bone fragments which contained cut and saw marks, the bones that somebody might attempt to cut through if they were dismembering a body. And they were of different shapes, which showed that a sharp-bladed instrument had been used, which had left V-shaped cut marks, and the saw had been used, which left box-shaped cut marks, clearly diagnostic of a saw of a certain size. There were striation marks on the bones, which showed where the saw had cut through the bone.
Denise's body had been cut up and then burnt. Police strongly suspected George Eckersley of planning and carrying out his wife's murder, but still needed more proof. Detectives turned again to the letter apparently sent by Denise before taking her own life. The letter was sent to a forensic laboratory for testing, where scientists found more incriminating evidence.
DNA on the envelope was found to match George Eckersley, Denise's husband.
Detectives quickly moved to arrest George Eckersley, catching up with him at Bradford Airport, about to board a flight to Amsterdam.
He later admitted hitting his wife with a candlestick, dismembering her body and incinerating it at his place of work.
As Eckersley revealed the details of his crime, it became clear just how calculated he had been.
It transpired that the person caught on camera was actually George, dressed as a woman in a blonde wig. George was engaging in an elaborate charade for up to a month, trying to convince people that Denise was still alive. He drove all around the northwest so that there would appear to be movement. He used the bank card to provide evidence that she was still alive. He even made several emotional appeals to the public and to her to return home so that people would think she was alive, and also wore her underwear so that when it was later found, it seemed worn as if she was still alive and wearing it until the point that he staged the suicide.
In 2001, George Eckersley was tried for his wife's murder. He pleaded guilty.
It's clear that the press really latched on to the fact that George dressed up as Denise to try and impersonate her to fool the police. It was almost put across in a slightly darkly comic way, and I can really see how that would sell papers. It's not something we see every day. It's quite unusual. What we need to remember in a case like this is that there are victims left behind. There's Denise's family, and there are a whole level of people who are affected by this tragic, tragic case.
For criminal psychologist Ruth Tully, George's behaviour gave a fascinating insight into the psychology of a criminal mind.
As a psychologist, what interests me is not just the behaviour within the tragic offence, but it's also the behaviour afterwards. I'd be very interested in assessing George's personality to look at if there were any key traits present that helped him to deceive people so calmly in terms of the lack of chaos afterwards. Quite often I see people who commit a serious crime and genuinely don't know what to do afterwards. They may admit to what they've done, or they may try a rushed attempt at covering things up. But there's something very different in a case where someone goes to such extreme lengths to try and cover up what they've done.
George Eckersley was sentenced to life with a recommendation he serve at least 16 years. Martin's evidence was crucial in establishing the intent and premeditation behind the crime.
We were able to show that this person, the perpetrator, planned this process and went to some length to carry it out. And it was reassuring to hear that the judge felt it had allowed him to say something in their judgment regarding the state of mind of the individual, in as much as it shows forethought and planning.
This was a really complex case. There was a lot of evidence to pick through, but because of George's deception, it wasn't clear what any of it meant. That's where forensic scientists and experts will pick through all of that information to the most minute detail to interpret it correctly, to ultimately aid the course of justice.
I think it was gratifying to find something out of 3,000 pieces that actually were relevant. It was good to know that I was able to make a helpful contribution to a major homicide investigation. That was very reassuring.